I was 40 miles away teaching a demolition safety course at Fort Benning when my neighbor called to tell me my house was on fire. By the time I arrived 35 minutes later, firefighters were pulling two small bodies from what used to be my children's bedroom. My 7-year-old daughter Emma and 5-year-old son Noah had been trapped on the second floor when someone poured gasoline around the perimeter of our house at 2 a.m. and lit it on fire. The arson investigator called it a professional job, accelerant patterns suggesting someone with knowledge of how fires spread and how to ensure maximum damage with minimum escape time. What Fire Marshal Stevens didn't know yet was that the person who set that fire was my brother-in-law Marcus Webb, and he just made a fatal mistake trying to kill a man who spent 15 years as an Army Ranger demolition expert teaching soldiers how to blow things up without leaving evidence. The call came at 2:47 a.m. while I was sleeping in base housing at Fort Benning, 40 miles from my home in Columbus, Georgia. I'd been teaching an advanced explosives course that week and had stayed on base rather than making the daily commute. My neighbor Tom Richardson's voice was shaking when I answered. "Jack, your house is on fire. I called 911 but the flames are massive. I can see them from my bedroom window. Where are Sarah and the kids?" My wife Sarah was visiting her sister in Atlanta for the weekend, taking a break from the stress of her father's recent death and estate disputes. Emma and Noah were supposed to be with Mrs. Patterson, our regular babysitter who lived 3 houses down. I was in my truck and driving before Tom finished explaining that fire trucks were already on scene. The 40-mile drive took 35 minutes of running red lights and pushing my F-150 to speeds that should have gotten me arrested. But the only thing that mattered was getting to my children, getting them out of whatever was happening, using every skill I'd learned in 15 years of Army Rangers to save my family. When I arrived, the scene looked like something from a war zone. Flames were shooting 40 feet into the night sky, consuming the 2-story colonial house where we'd lived for 8 years. Fire trucks surrounded the property, firefighters attacking the blaze from multiple angles while neighbors stood in their yards watching our lives burn. I jumped out of my truck and ran toward the house, but 2 firefighters grabbed me before I could reach the front door. "Sir, you can't go in there. The structure is compromised. The second floor is about to collapse. That's my house. My children are inside. I need to get them out." The firefighters exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know before Fire Marshal Stevens approached with the expression of someone who delivered this kind of news too many times. "Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry. We found 2 children on the second floor, bedroom on the right side. They didn't suffer. The smoke got them before the flames did." The world stopped making sense for approximately 30 seconds. Emma, who wanted to be a veterinarian and had just learned to ride a bike without training wheels. Noah, who was obsessed with dinosaurs and made me read him the same book about T-Rex every single night before bed. Both of them were gone, killed while I was 40 miles away teaching other soldiers how to use explosives safely. The rational part of my brain shut down while the operator part took over, the part that had kept me alive through 3 deployments and dozens of missions. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to analyze the situation tactically instead of emotionally. "Fire Marshal Stevens, how did the fire start?" His expression shifted from sympathy to professional assessment. "It's too early to say definitively, but the burn patterns suggest accelerant use. Gasoline or something similar poured around the foundation and ignited simultaneously at multiple points. This wasn't an accident, Mr. Bennett. This was arson, and whoever did it knew what they were doing." "Where's Mrs. Patterson?" "The babysitter who was supposed to be watching them." Stevens checked his notes. "We found an elderly woman unconscious in her home 3 houses down. Appears she was drugged. Paramedics took her to Columbus Regional about 20 minutes ago. She's alive but unresponsive. Someone had planned this carefully. Drugged the babysitter to remove the only adult supervision, waited until the middle of the night when neighbors would be asleep, then set a fire designed to spread fast enough that my children wouldn't have time to escape. This wasn't random violence or a burglary gone wrong. This was murder, premeditated and executed with enough sophistication that the perpetrator clearly had knowledge of fire behavior and accelerant patterns. The kind of knowledge that someone might have if they'd spent time around demolition experts or had military training themselves. I called Sarah from the scene, and her screams echoed through the phone so loudly that firefighters 20 feet away could hear them. "I'm coming home right now. Tell me this isn't real. Tell me our babies are okay." I couldn't tell her that because it would be a lie, and lying to my wife about our children's deaths wasn't something I was capable of doing regardless of how much I wanted to spare her the pain. "Sarah, Emma and Noah are gone. Someone set fire to the house while they were sleeping. I need you to stay with your sister in Atlanta until I figure out what happened and who did this. You can't come back here right now. It's not safe." But through Sarah's sobbing, I heard another voice in the background. Her brother Marcus Webb, demanding to know what was happening and why his sister was hysterical. Marcus had always been a problem, the kind of man who drifted between jobs and schemes, always looking for the easy path to success without putting in actual work. He'd been especially aggressive lately about his father's estate, angry that Sarah had inherited the family business while he'd been left with a modest cash payout. But estate disputes didn't typically escalate to murdering children, and I couldn't imagine any scenario where Marcus would be capable of something this evil. Over the next 3 days while the fire marshal's office investigated, I stayed with Tom and his wife Linda, sleeping in their guest room when I could sleep at all and spending every waking hour reviewing the arson investigation findings. The accelerant patterns confirmed this was professional work. Gasoline had been poured in a specific pattern around the house's foundation, creating a ring of fire that spread inward and upward simultaneously. The pour pattern suggested someone with knowledge of how structures burn, how to ensure maximum damage to second-floor bedrooms while preventing escape through first-floor exits. But the most damning evidence came from security camera footage from a neighbor's house across the street. At 1:53 a.m., a dark blue pickup truck had parked 3 houses down from mine. A figure in dark clothing had exited carrying what appeared to be gas cans, spent approximately 8 minutes moving around my property, then driven away at 2:04 a.m. 11 minutes later. My house had exploded into flames. The security footage was grainy and the license plate wasn't visible, but the truck's make and model were clear. A 2018 Ford F-250, dark blue, with a distinctive dent in the rear bumper. Marcus Webb drove a 2018 Ford F-250, dark blue, with a dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot accident 6 months earlier. I'd helped him file the insurance claim, never imagining that detail would later identify him as the person who murdered my children. But vehicle identification wasn't enough for prosecution. I needed motive, opportunity, and evidence that definitively placed Marcus at the scene. And more importantly, I needed to understand why my brother-in-law would kill 2 innocent children who'd never done anything except call him Uncle Marcus and give him crayon drawings on his birthday. The motive became clear when I started investigating Sarah's father's estate with help from the family attorney. Robert Webb had died 3 months earlier, leaving behind a successful construction company worth approximately $8 million. His will had been very specific. Sarah inherited controlling interest in the company because she'd worked there for 15 years and understood the business. Marcus received $500,000 in cash and some investment properties, a generous inheritance by any standard but nowhere near the value of the company itself. Marcus had contested the will immediately, claiming that his father had been manipulated by Sarah and that he deserved equal shares of everything. But there was something else in the estate documents that changed everything. A life insurance policy on Sarah's life, taken out by their father years earlier, with her children listed as primary beneficiaries and Marcus as the contingent beneficiary if anything happened to Sarah and the kids. The policy was worth $5 million, and the contingent beneficiary clause meant that if Emma and Noah died before Sarah, Marcus would inherit the full amount. My brother-in-law hadn't just killed my children out of rage or revenge. He'd murdered them as part of a calculated plan to inherit life insurance money that should have gone to them. I took this information to Detective Angela Martinez at Columbus PD, the lead investigator on the arson case. She reviewed the estate documents, the security footage, and the accelerant patterns with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent 20 years putting together complex prosecutions. Mr. Bennett, this is strong circumstantial evidence, but we need something that places Marcus definitively at the scene. The truck identification isn't enough because he could claim it was stolen or borrowed. We need forensic evidence, witnesses, or a confession. I can get you all 3, I said quietly. Because Marcus doesn't know that I spent 15 years learning how to conduct investigations in hostile territory, and he doesn't know that Army Ranger demolition experts are trained to analyze explosive and incendiary devices. If Marcus set that fire, he made mistakes. And I know exactly how to find them. Detective Martinez studied me for a long moment. Mr. Bennett, I need to be very clear. You cannot conduct your own investigation. You cannot approach your brother-in-law. You cannot take any action that would compromise our case or put yourself in legal jeopardy. I understand, Detective. I'm just a grieving father who wants justice for his children. Everything I discover will be provided to you through proper channels. She didn't believe me, but she also understood that sometimes justice requires unconventional methods. Just make sure whatever you find is admissible in court. I don't want this case thrown out on technicalities. That night, I returned to what remained of my house for the first time since the fire. The structure had been condemned, but the fire marshal's office had completed their evidence collection and the property was technically mine. I stood in what used to be my living room, surrounded by charred wood and melted belongings, and forced myself to think like an operator instead of a father. Marcus had used gasoline as accelerant, which was traceable. He'd poured it in a specific pattern, which required time and planning. He'd done this at night, which meant he needed light to see what he was doing. And most importantly, he'd driven his personal vehicle to the scene, which meant potential forensic evidence inside the truck. I started with the burn patterns, photographing them from multiple angles and comparing them to patterns I'd studied during my demolition training. The pour marks showed someone working methodically from the back of the house toward the front, creating a U-shaped pattern designed to trap anyone on the second floor. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was someone who understood structure fires and had planned every detail. But Marcus had made mistakes that only someone with my training would recognize. The gasoline concentration was uneven in several spots, creating gaps in the accelerant pattern that had allowed firefighters to approach from specific angles. The pour pattern also showed hesitation marks where the accelerant flow had stopped and started, suggesting the person setting the fire had paused multiple times, possibly due to nervousness or unfamiliarity with large-scale arson. Most tellingly, there were footprints in the ash near the back door, preserved by the pattern of water damage from firefighting efforts. Size 11 work boots with a distinctive tread pattern that I recognized because I'd gone shopping with Marcus 3 months earlier when he needed new boots for a construction job. I photographed everything, documented the footprint pattern, and collected samples of unburned accelerant from areas the fire marshal's team had missed. Then I did something that would either solve this case or destroy any chance of prosecution. I went to Marcus's apartment at 3 a.m., picked the lock using skills I'd learned during ranger training, and conducted a search that would have been completely illegal if discovered. What I found in Marcus's apartment confirmed everything I'd suspected and provided evidence that would destroy him in court if I could figure out how to introduce it legally. Hidden in Marcus's closet were the clothes he'd worn during the arson. Dark jeans and a black hoodie, both reeking of gasoline and showing burn marks from blowback when the accelerant ignited. The boots he'd worn were stuffed in a garbage bag, same size 11 work boots with the identical tread pattern I'd photographed at my house. Most damning was a handwritten timeline on a notepad in his desk drawer, detailing his plan to drug Mrs. Patterson, set the fire, and establish an alibi by being seen at a bar across town around the time the fire started. Marcus had documented his own crime in enough detail to guarantee a conviction if this evidence could be introduced legally. I photographed everything with a high-resolution camera, then left the apartment exactly as I'd found it. The evidence existed, but I couldn't use it directly without admitting to an illegal search that would get the case thrown out and possibly get me arrested. I needed Marcus to lead law enforcement to this evidence himself, which meant creating a situation where he'd panic and make mistakes. Over the next week, I began a psychological operation designed to make Marcus believe his plan was unraveling. I started by having Detective Martinez request a formal interview. Nothing accusatory, just routine questions about his whereabouts the night of the fire and his relationship with Sarah's family. Marcus agreed to the interview with the confidence of someone who believed he'd committed the perfect crime. He explained that he'd been at Sullivan's bar from midnight until 3 a.m., had witnesses who could confirm his presence, and was devastated by the deaths of his niece and nephew. The alibi was solid because Marcus had carefully established it, buying drinks for strangers and making sure the bartender remembered him. But alibis only work if the timeline matches the evidence, and I was about to introduce information that would destroy Marcus's carefully constructed story. I provided Detective Martinez with enhanced security footage from multiple neighbors' cameras, footage that I'd obtained through methods I didn't explain and she didn't ask about. The enhanced images showed the truck's license plate clearly, proving definitively that Marcus's F-250 had been at the scene. More importantly, the footage showed Marcus entering Sullivan's bar at 12:15 a.m., leaving through the back door at 1:30 a.m., returning at 2:45 a.m., and staying until closing. The gap in his alibi lined up perfectly with the arson timeline. When confronted with this evidence, Marcus changed his story. He admitted to leaving the bar briefly but claimed he'd just gone outside for fresh air and a phone call. But cell phone records I'd obtained through a contact at the phone company showed Marcus's phone pinging off a tower near my house at 1:53 a.m., exactly when the security footage showed the truck arriving. The circumstantial evidence was building into a prosecution case that Marcus couldn't talk his way out of, and I could see the panic starting to set in as he realized his perfect crime was falling apart. The breaking point came when I arranged for Marcus to receive an anonymous package at his apartment. Inside was a single item, a child's drawing that Emma had made of our family, recovered from the fire scene and carefully preserved. The back of the drawing had a note in my handwriting that read, I know what you did. I know why you did it. And I'm coming for everything you thought you'd gain. The psychological impact was exactly what I'd intended. Marcus had killed my children for insurance money, and now he was being haunted by evidence of their existence. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus made every mistake I'd predicted he would make. First, he tried to access the life insurance policy to see if he could claim the money immediately, which created a paper trail of his financial motive. Second, he drove to a storage unit on the outskirts of Columbus where he'd hidden additional evidence, not knowing that I'd been following him using surveillance techniques learned during Ranger training. Third, and most damning, he called a lawyer specializing in arson defense and had a conversation that was recorded by a wiretap Detective Martinez had secured through proper legal channels after I'd provided enough probable cause. The lawyer advised Marcus to get rid of any evidence connecting him to the fire, specifically mentioning gasoline-soaked clothing and the boots he'd worn. That conversation gave police legal justification to search Marcus's apartment with a proper warrant. When they executed the search warrant 3 days later, they found everything I'd already photographed: the gasoline-soaked clothes, the distinctive boots, and most damning, the handwritten timeline documenting his plan to commit arson and murder. Marcus was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, arson, and insurance fraud. The trial took place 6 months after Emma and Noah's deaths, and I attended every single day of proceedings. Sarah sat beside me, her face hollow and aged from grief that had transformed her from my vibrant wife into a ghost of the woman I'd married. Marcus's defense attorney tried to claim the evidence had been planted, that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a grieving father who'd been conducting an illegal investigation. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming. The gasoline residue on Marcus's clothes matched the accelerant used at the arson scene. The boot prints matched perfectly. The cell phone records placed him at the scene. And the handwritten timeline in his own handwriting documented premeditation. The prosecution's closing argument focused on something that resonated with the jury more than technical evidence. They showed pictures of Emma and Noah, smiling and innocent, and asked the jury to imagine what those children's final moments had been like. Trapped on the second floor, surrounded by flames, calling for their father who couldn't save them because he was 40 miles away while their uncle murdered them for insurance money. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Marcus to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years for arson and insurance fraud. But before the sentencing was finalized, the judge allowed me to deliver a victim impact statement that I'd been preparing for 6 months. I stood at the podium facing Marcus and spoke with the controlled calm of someone who'd spent 15 years training to remain functional under extreme stress. Marcus, you killed my children because you wanted money. You drugged an elderly woman, poured gasoline around my house, and lit a fire that burned Emma and Noah alive while they slept. You did this knowing they would suffer, knowing they would be terrified, and not caring because their lives meant less to you than $5 million in insurance money. But what you didn't know is that Emma had drawn a picture the day before she died. It was a family picture with you in it because despite everything she loved her Uncle Marcus and thought you loved her too. That picture survived the fire, and I carry it with me every day as a reminder that my children died believing the best in people, even people who didn't deserve it. I paused, letting that information sink in before delivering the final blow. You also didn't know that I spent 15 years as an Army Ranger demolition expert. I understand fires, accelerants, and burn patterns better than most arson investigators. Every mistake you made, every piece of evidence you left behind, I found it and documented it and made sure it would put you in prison for the rest of your miserable life. Marcus sat at the defendant's table with his head down, refusing to make eye contact. The judge added a final statement before concluding the sentencing. Mr. Webb, you betrayed your family in the most heinous way possible. You murdered innocent children for money, then tried to console their mother at their funeral while knowing you were responsible for their deaths. Your sentence reflects not just the crimes you committed, but the depravity required to commit them. I hope you spend every day of your life in prison remembering Emma and Noah's faces and understanding that their blood is on your hands. After the trial, Sarah and I tried to rebuild our lives from the wreckage Marcus had created. Our marriage didn't survive the grief because we reminded each other too much of what we'd lost. We divorced 2 years after the fire, not out of anger or blame, but because we needed to process our trauma separately and couldn't do it while living in the same space. I left Georgia and moved to Montana, taking a job teaching survival skills to law enforcement and military personnel. The work kept me busy and gave me purpose, but nothing filled the hole left by Emma and Noah's absence. 5 years after their deaths, I received a letter from Marcus in prison. It was 8 pages of justification, explanation, and pathetic attempts to make me understand why he'd done what he'd done. He claimed he'd been desperate for money, that Sarah had stolen his inheritance, that he never meant for the children to actually die. The letter ended with a request for forgiveness and a bizarre suggestion that maybe someday we could have a relationship again. I burned the letter without finishing it because Marcus Webb didn't deserve my forgiveness or my attention. He deserved exactly what he got, life in prison with the knowledge that he'd destroyed his own family for money he'd never see. 10 years after the fire, I started a foundation called Emma and Noah's Legacy, dedicated to helping families affected by arson and providing resources for fire safety education in low-income communities. We installed smoke detectors in over 5,000 homes, taught fire safety to 20,000 children, and helped 47 families rebuild after losing their homes to arson. The foundation became my way of transforming grief into purpose, ensuring that my children's deaths meant something beyond the tragedy of their loss. 15 years after Marcus murdered my children, I remarried to a woman named Claire who understood that some wounds never fully heal but can be transformed into strength. We had a daughter together, and I named her Emma Grace, carrying forward the memory of the little girl who wanted to be a veterinarian and loved drawing pictures of our family. My new daughter will grow up knowing about the sister she never met, understanding that Emma and Noah's lives mattered and that their deaths led to changes that protected other children. Marcus Webb died in prison 18 years after his conviction, killed by another inmate who'd learned that he'd murdered children. I didn't celebrate his death because that would have required caring about him as a person, and he'd stopped being a person to me the moment he poured gasoline around my house. He was just a problem I'd solved, a threat I'd eliminated using skills the Army had taught me and dedication that came from being a father who'd failed to protect his children when they needed him most. 20 years after the fire, I visited the memorial garden that the city of Columbus had built on the site where my house once stood. Emma and Noah's names were engraved on a stone bench surrounded by flowers that community volunteers maintained year-round. I sat on that bench thinking about all the moments I'd missed, graduations and weddings and grandchildren I'd never meet because Marcus Webb decided their lives were worth less than insurance money. But I also thought about the 20,000 children who'd learned fire safety through our foundation, the 5,000 homes now equipped with smoke detectors, and the 47 families who'd rebuilt after tragedy because Emma and Noah's legacy provided resources and hope. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories of justice and resilience. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and share your thoughts on how we protect the innocent when evil hides in our own families. Remember that some people will betray any trust and hurt anyone if they believe it serves their interests. But justice, real justice, requires patience, skill, and the determination to see it through regardless of cost. Emma and Noah Bennett deserved better than the uncle who murdered them, but their memory inspired changes that protected thousands of other children. Until next time, stay strong and never forget that the best revenge is building something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. The end.